12. I warned ya. I warned ya. So the second entry to the series on this list, Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back. Take everything I've said about the first Crash Bandicoot and multiply it by 10 and sprinkle a few new flaws onto it, but let's not get into that. Properly leaping off from the base built in Crash Bandicoot, Cortex Strikes Back was a more smooth, refined experience, once again proving how talented Naughty Dog's developers are, expanding heavily on the core of Crash Bandicoot while eliminating almost every flaw, adding many new features and playstyles, which all integrated perfectly into the base that they built, jetpack notwithstanding, and introducing a lot of tropes and characters which have stuck with the series to this day. The controls and platforming mechanics were still perfectly slick and endlessly gratifying, with the realistic weighty feel and simulated gravity, leaving it all up to skill and timing. The music and atmosphere was all there, it looked better and more varied, amazing progression which provided variety within the simple core that keeps you stimulated and challenged, but rarely going overboard, and always keeping to the simple controls minus the idiotic jetpack sections. But once again, let's not get into that. And more. Not quite perfect, but it's everything a good sequel is supposed to be, in taking what the first game did and building upon it with nearly perfect execution, leaping off from the original to create a brand new classic experience. 11. Ah yes, the superhero genre. A genre that by all rights should be the easiest to nail down because a lot of these superheroes have potential for unique game mechanics, and if not, at least comic books can promise a healthy dose of action. But so many of them end up being absolute shit. But one of the first truly outstanding superhero games that was finally able to break this trend was the simply named Spider-Man. Talk about action-packed. You have everything. Escaping attack helicopters, city chases, harrowing crawls through the sewers to track down Venom, action-packed fight scenes, and so much more. It properly juxtaposes its exciting levels with more methodical bits, which gives a good contrast and makes every level all the more memorable by giving you perspective, as well as having tight combat, highly responsive controls, a kick-ass soundtrack, a bunch of attacks which adds to the strategy of each fight and makes use of Spider-Man's powers, giving you a unique experience that you couldn't find anywhere else beyond the significantly inferior sequel. Personally, I think Stan Lee sums this game up perfectly.
So get ready for a true superhero action thriller, packed to the brim with thrills and chills, twists and turns, more supervillains than you can shake a web at, and of course, non-stop web-slinging, wall-crawling action.
And without wishing to spoil, it has one of the best and most genuinely frightening final bosses of any game I've ever seen. Overall, Spider-Man is action-packed and one of the best superhero games ever made. And the most hilarious thing is, Spider-Man and Superman 64 came out just over a year apart. Makes you think. 10. Skateboarding games and me have a long and varied history. It's like an old sweater I can always put on if I felt down, but in terms of comfy sweaters I wore too much, the best example was Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. Up there with Ripto's Rage in terms of my most played games of all time, and there's a good reason for that. This is quite possibly the greatest skateboarding game ever made. Talk about smooth, free-flowing controls. This is beyond perfect. The ridiculously fast, exciting pace with the 2-minute timer and the open-ended but perfectly designed levels, allowing for massive combos cracking off one after another, and the reward for beating the campaign only serves to add tons of longevity, replay value, and progression to the already fantastic base of the previous game. And talk about precise. Every single trick in this game is so perfect mechanically that it's 100% down to you. Every single thing in this game is so slick and so precise that there's absolutely no handicap, and rattling off those massive combos is stimulating, challenging, but completely doable and down to you. And that's just how this game plays, and that's what makes it so great. Not to mention having one of the best licensed soundtracks ever, or the very trick list, but at the end of the day, I played this game endlessly simply because it's one of the best games to play in terms of overall feel and control ever. This was also my most all-time played game because at one point I accidentally erased my completed campaign and had to start from scratch. Oops. 9. In my opinion, when it comes to games, 3s tend to be the best because it's after they've worked out all the kinks and are able to refine the overall experience, and in some cases this tends to be the popular opinion, such as this one, seeing as this is popularly considered the best game on the PS1, though obviously I wouldn't go that far, and of course we're talking about Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. There's no doubt in my mind that this is as close to a perfect traditional Crash Bandicoot game as we can get. Controls and core gameplay as refined and fun as we could ever have, and the addition of new abilities to really spice up the gameplay and add a ton of variety, on top of the base gameplay like the double jump, super spin, or my personal favorite, the Wumpa Bazooka, which also adds a whole bunch of new ways to play the game while sticking to the same formula, along with the perfectly slick controls and the satisfying gameplay, the great soundtrack, the graphics which look even better than before, and whatever else I could say. The summary is Crash Bandicoot 3 warped is everything that made the previous games great, refined to a T and turned up to 100 while adding a whole bunch of new gameplay additions integrated even better into the core gameplay, and a few new playstyles to break up the standard levels that aren't as good but are still great, and even if you don't like them, at least they're similar enough to other gameplay sections and are introduced early enough that they're integrated naturally into the gameplay. It's an almost perfect game, and I don't say that lightly. It's almost a shame that it's this high up on the list, but that's because we're really only getting started, and that's just a testament to the quality of the next 8 games. 8. A lot of early PS1 games really didn't control that well because when it was first released, you only had the D-pad to move, and it wasn't until the DualShock analog controller was released that games could take advantage, but it having been programmed into my mind to use the D-pad, I usually didn't bother. Until I played a game that ties you down and forces you to use the analog sticks and forced you to learn to love them, and honestly, that's exactly what it did. Of course, that game being Ape Escape. An example of a game selling itself on technology still holding up, fully utilizing the controller to create an utterly unique experience that you can't get anywhere else beyond the significantly inferior sequels. I guess it's considered a collectathon, but it's an utterly unique one where the goal is to catch monkeys that threaten to unravel time itself. It's a long story, each one of which has a unique personality and different tactics to catch, creating an endlessly varied game coupled with the amount of tools you gradually unlock throughout the game, which organically unlocks more and more of the world, and with the time travel setting, every level is beautiful and unique from feudal Japan to prehistoric Dino Land. Then you have one of my favorite soundtracks of any game with its varying funky catchy techno. It's an utterly unique, varied, and fun experience that's distinctly Japanese, but not in the oh dear god this makes me uncomfortable kind of way like most anime with me, but in the sense that it's so compellingly weird and out there that you can't help but love it. It's a fantastic game top to bottom. Shame about the voice acting though.
What's happening? What's wrong with you? Do you realize what you're saying? Do you know who you're talking to?
7. And so it begins. Alright, strap yourselves in, it's going to be a predictable ride. You all knew this was coming, so let's get started. This is a game that holds a very special place in my heart because it's not only the first game in one of my favorite game series ever, but it's also the very first PS1 game I ever played, which of course is Spyro the Dragon. I love this game. Where do I start? It manages a free-flowing natural movement system without analog control. It has simple yet gratifying 3-tier collection. It looks beautiful in how colorful it is and how it's able to render the entire map, not to mention how it's one of the most highly detailed games on the PlayStation. The soundtrack is stunning, the characters are likable and varied, and it's such a relaxing, chill game. The roaming and the exploring is such a relaxing thing to do. It's such a beautifully simple game while also finding room to evolve and add complexity while always finding a way to stay relaxing while ramping the difficulty up to a meaty challenge over the course of the game, and makes clever use of the platforming mechanics and expansive world. Very rare among games of this era, this world just feels massive. Yeah, it's mostly just down to combat, exploration, and collection, but that's the triple threat that defines the series. A triangle that with the 3 points holds everything together and each point builds off the other two. And with the 3-tier collection and the constant evolution of the gameplay, it keeps the experience fresh throughout. It feels good to blast enemy, it feels good to save the dragons, it just feels good to play. The minimal story and simple yet satisfying gameplay really lends itself to making Spyro the Dragon one of the best, most replayable, most relaxing games on the PlayStation. But in spite of being one of the most chill zen experiences on the system, also having a great deal of depth and fun, being one of the most vast, open-ended yet lively games on the system. A great start for the Purple Dragon. 6. Some inclusions on lists like this are practically mandatory, which is fine. It's a testament to how great a game is that it can widely be considered one of the best games of its respective time. And I'm not so proud that I would ever dismiss or downplay the quality of a game just to be different, because I'm not that fucking pretentious. I mean, I'm pretentious, just not that pretentious. With that in mind, introducing Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Another prime example of using limitations to your advantage, where most games were moving towards full 3D, Dragon Force Symphony of the Night said fuck it and stuck to highly detailed stylized 2D pixel art, and it looks gorgeous. And with that comes an almost unreasonable amount of variety. Almost every room you go into has new enemies, and that variety also extends into the gameplay. This being an action RPG, there's probably a million different ways to play, and this also being considered one of the most famous examples of Metroidvania, it encompasses every positive trait that genre has to offer. Endless exploration and discovery, always having somewhere to go when you get stuck, and that smug feeling of being able to backtrack and suddenly dominate the enemies that were giving you trouble. Couple that with fun, stimulating hack and slash gameplay. Okay, it doesn't start too exciting, but it quickly gains a ton of depth, and we're not even taking into account the magic spells. And then you have a compelling plot centered around Alucard's duality, fighting for people who will never accept him, and then you have one of the deepest and best games on the PlayStation. Check back next time for the conclusion to this list.